Good evening and welcome to the Charles River Conservancy Parkland show. My name is Renata von Tscharner and we will be talking about the Parklands and a very special spot along the Parklands. A very lively spot, as you will hear. And I have tonight with me a guest, Bill Clendaniel. Welcome.
Thank you.
Bill Clendaniel is the President Emeritus of the Mount Auburn Cemetery, and you were in that position for 20 years. And prior to that, you were the Deputy Director of the Trustees of Reservations for 10 years. And we of course know that there's a strong connection with the trustees and the Charles River Parklands because of Charles Elliott. Charles Elliott, the landscape architect, and I think we'll see the picture of his father later on.
Right.
Now, this cemetery that is right on the Charles River, can you tell us of how this cemetery got here? It is nestled right where the river makes the sharpest curve. To the left of that curve is the cemetery that we see here. Tell us of how this cemetery was placed here, Bill.
Well, the founders of the cemetery in the 1820s looked a long time around Boston for the right spot. They wanted to have a natural area in which to bury their loved ones, and they referred to it in the consecration address at how wonderful a spot this was because it had lots of topography and it had a mountain, Mount Auburn, and it looked out over the river. So they were looking for a pastoral kind of place. And Mount Auburn, unlike the rest of Cambridge and Watertown, was not farmed. It was left natural in 1831 when the cemetery was founded.
Mm-hmm. So there were dwellings across the river, but those hills, the Mount Auburn hill, was open land.
Right. There was a farm on the newer part of the cemetery towards the river, but the cemetery in time bought that and turned it into a cemetery landscape instead of a farm landscape.
Mm-hmm. We have a picture here, an aerial picture, which shows the river, downtown Boston, and this triangle that comes towards us. This is the cemetery.
I always refer to this as the Ritz-Carlton for birds, because if you were a bird flying up or down the eastern seaboard and you saw this magnificent piece of open space with its ponds and its trees, that would be the place to go. But the other important point to make is that, as you can see from this picture, it overlooks the city. And indeed, from Mount Auburn, you can still see the city of Boston, the State House, all of the early buildings that the founders would have known and loved. So in the cemetery, in a natural area, well outside the city as it then was, but looking back to the city.
Mm-hmm. You have referred to several times as this being a cemetery for Boston.
Right.
Tell us, people today think of the Mount Auburn Cemetery being in Cambridge, but it was really a burial ground for the whole of Boston.
Right, that's right. They looked at sites in Boston, but nothing was suitable, and this was the best place. But they were Bostonians, the founders, and Canterbridgians. They came, I think they saw themselves as a larger community than we sometimes do today. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of course, both communities were much, much smaller. So people like Justice Story here, who was a sitting Supreme Court justice, at the time he was named the first president of Mount Auburn, was talking about the whole community, Boston, Cambridge, and the surrounding area.
Mm. So he's kind of known as the founder.
Well, he was, yes, along with Jacob Bigelow, who was really the leader. But Story, in his consecration address, talks at some length about the Charles, and so I think from the very beginning it was seen as although we are not technically right on the bank, it was seen as an important part of our landscape.
There is a wonderful picture you have here of a tower that overlooks the Charles. If you go up to this tower, you see the Charles all the way to the harbor and to downtown. And so that is probably a reason why many people come. It's a park.
That's right, and with wonderful views because you're up above the trees. And I would urge everyone to, as you drive around Boston, look for that tower because it pops up in surprising places sometimes. But
Yeah,
it's,
and this is a view from the tower, I would think,
yes,
with the Harvard Stadium in the foreground and then the skyline of Boston. So it's a wonderful way to take somebody. I often take out-of-town guests there to
Yes.
give them a sense of the setting of the Charles and of the downtown, the proximity to downtown. Now, is Mount Auburn still? You would say it's a birding place, it's a park, but it's still a burial ground.
yes, indeed, very active cemetery. 500 people a year roughly buried, and we're still selling space. Anyone can come and buy space today, both for casket burial and cremation. And we do cremations at Mount Auburn, so it's an active place. I used to talk about it having two legs. One was its visitor, leisure, kind of recreational, and the other was the business side, if you will. Both very important to us.
So, but if you are going there as a park, I think we have to remind people you cannot take a dog, you cannot take your bike, and no
That's right.
inline skates.
No.
So it is walking mostly.
Out of respect
yeah.
for not only the dead, but the people who are visiting graves. We have funerals virtually every workday, and of course, lots of people come and visit graves. And it's 175 acres, which sounds rather large, but in fact, it can be seen somewhat intimately, and it's hard to have a lot of activity that doesn't impinge on the rest of the cemetery. So that's why we keep it.
What is
controlled.
so unusual about this cemetery and very different from the Cambridge Cemetery across Coolidge Avenue is that it has valleys, it has very secluded areas that really
Right.
invite
It's just
observation.
I've traveled all over the world, of course, looking at cemeteries, and there are very few that come anywhere near the beauty of the landscape of Mount Auburn.
You mentioned the beauty of the landscape, but when I first went there, for me, it was also an architectural pleasure because you
Yes.
have a lot of monuments that are very architectural, very sculptural, and you have the whole range, the whole eclectic range of,
That's right.
of tombs.
And a lot of buildings as well. We have 2 chapels and private mausoleums that rise to the statue of architecture.
Now, you brought the picture here, which shows the horse railroad, and that was from downtown Boston to
To
the
Mount
cemetery.
Auburn, as it says right on the car, to Mount Auburn. And Boston, we should be very proud of ourselves. We started so many things in this country, including outside a revolution, but this was the first horse-drawn railroad, if you will, trolley line in the country. And Mount Auburn was indeed the first landscaped cemetery in the country. So this streetcar picture just reminds us how important it was to Bostonians who were taking a streetcar out to the cemetery to visit loved ones or attend a funeral.
Yeah, explain a little bit more what you mean by landscaped of, the burial ground, like we would find downtown Boston.
Well, it was very much a reaction against those burial grounds. In fact, the use of the word cemetery came with Mount Auburn. It's a different concept. I think the earlier people didn't pay much attention to where they buried their dead. It was sort of get them in the ground and
More
forget
functional
them. More
or-
functional, exactly.
So this is almost a romantic
Exactly.
notion.
Religion was changing, the ideas of landscape were changing, and the idea was large family lots outside the city in a place of great beauty. And I think all of us today, for whom plants and grass and flowers are what we expect to have in a cemetery, it makes sense. We feel more comfortable in these wonderful natural areas than these urban, very tightly constrained burial grounds.
Yeah.